This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. We're coming to you here on the 28th of July as the 43rd anniversary of the death of Father Rother. 43 years ago that Blessed Stanley Rother was killed in his rectory. This was in Santiago Atitlan, Guatemala, where he had been assigned as a missionary pastor 13 years before. He was part of Micatocla, Misión Católica de Oklahoma, the Spanish acronyms for the Oklahoma Catholic Mission, that had been established by the Diocese of Oklahoma City and Tulsa in 1965 to serve the Tzutujil people on the shores of Lago Atitlan in the Mayan highlands of Guatemala. Blessed Stanley's murder came as a shock to the Americans who staffed the various mission parishes in that Central American country. Of all of the men and women from the United States who had responded to the papal invitation to come from North America to serve the Church of Latin America, issued in 1961, Stan was regarded as one of the least vocal and probably the least radical. He had stayed away from taking sides in the complicated struggle going on throughout Guatemala and El Salvador in those years, contrasting him with many of his compatriots who were very vocal indeed. Yet it was he who was the pastor of the strategically important village of Santiago, he who had opposed the tactics of the army commander who had initiated a bloody anti-insurgency campaign in the village that included kidnapping and torture and murder. He who had gathered the bodies of those tortured to death and thus became a witness to the blood and mayhem of those tactics. He who had been present when his principal catechist, who had been taken by an army patrol and then mutilated and killed. In sum, it was Stan who stood in the crosshairs of the power politics of this desperate time. And it was he who paid the price of his vantage point. Stan Rother had come to Santiago as an unlikely choice. He had spent 5 unexceptional years in Oklahoma as an associate pastor. The most interesting part of those years had been in Durant, Oklahoma, where he had served as the junior member of the pastoral team there and also as the principal carpenter, working on several cabins placed on land leased from the Army Corps of Engineers at Lake Texoma, which were to be used by the diocese for meetings and lodging. He'd also spent some time in Oklahoma City and Tulsa, serving in parishes there. In 1968, he had been recruited by the pastor of Santiago, Father Ramon Carlin, who wanted him to join the mission team and fill the spot most needed there, that of handyman and mechanic. As the assignments were distributed that year, he found himself placed at the mission and was Micatocla bound. Stan took to the challenge of the mission well. He became a part of the team there and soon grew to appreciate the grit of the people and their difficult circumstances. While he had grown up in Okarche and had had little contact with the wide world, his talents for fixing things extended even outside his mechanical aptitude to the problems and necessities of parish life. It also helped him that he was a favorite of the pastor, who promoted his interests and worked especially hard to make sure he could learn the ways of the parish and the needs of the people. More than anything else, Stan displayed a special talent at learning the language there, a Mayan tongue, the smallest of the 21 extant Mayan languages spoken in Guatemala, called Tzutujil. Stan surprised everyone, except perhaps Father Carlin, at his adaptability and his pastoral propensities. He began to bloom there. This was a difficult time in the life of the Church. Following the Second Vatican Council, there was a great deal of upset amid clerical life. It wasn't just that questions about lifestyles and pastoral priorities were receiving different answers at this time. It was that new questions were being asked about the value of missionary ministry and the threat of cultural domination amid the proclamation of the gospel. These were difficult questions to answer. Indeed, some of them have not yet been answered up to now. But they all contributed to shaking the foundations of the Oklahoma mission and its work there. Within a few years of Father Stan's arrival, most of the original staff was gone. By 1975, Stan was the only priest left in the parish and had been named pastor. It was tough going, especially since he was left to redefine the work of the mission and its presence among the people there. It's difficult for us to appreciate this aspect of the missionary life, but Stan had to negotiate his pastoral work within the structures and power base of the parish. That might sound odd to our ears since we live amid the settled arrangements of our parishes, but this work was very much a part of the agenda for his ministry. In the formation of the parish, the original missionaries in the 1500s had established brotherhoods and guilds to provide for the various aspects of ministerial life. Over the centuries, these cofradías, as they were called, guilds, had accepted the administration of the parish as well as guarded the heritage of worship and practice among the people there. Authority and leadership were passed down from generation to generation as the church remained at the heart of the religious life of the people. When the Oklahomans arrived and took up residence there in the rectory, then assuming the work of ministry in the parish, they were challenged to move this traditional mode of leadership toward cooperation with the work and leadership of the priests there. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't easy. Ignoring them was not an option. After all, they were the leaders of the parish, and this dynamic operated all over Guatemala. It was not a challenge that was only particular to Santiago. Father McSherry, who took over the parish after Father Rother was murdered, described a U.S. priest friend of his who was present in his own parish for 5 years before the members of the cofradia there entrusted him with the keys of his own parish church. Stan had to set to work amid the various poles of power and authority to work to make the parish a place where the church could come to full stature. While he was doing this, in 1979, the Sandinistas took over the Somoza government in Nicaragua, and the administration in Washington was in panic. The Sandinistas were favorable to Cuban support, and giving the Soviet Union through Cuba a foothold in Central America set off alarm bells throughout the State Department, who then worked to contain the potential damage there. They also worked to neutralize any additional efforts to overthrow the friendly governments in the remaining countries of Central America, efforts that had been present in small scale for decades. And the Soviet Union was also interested in using the surprise victory in Nicaragua as a stepping stone to put additional pressure on the U.S. In response, American military aid flowed to all of the countries of Central America, including Guatemala. These dynamics worked to make the Mayan highlands the battleground of the superpowers as they wrestled with each other for influence and impact among the people there. In response, in 1979, the Guatemalan army occupied Santiago Atitlan as part of their effort to address the insurgency taking place in the highlands there. Stan then had to begin to negotiate with this source of power and authority as well, working to exercise his priesthood while the soldiers in the encampment on the edge of town were patrolling the streets and arresting his parishioners. It was a difficult time for everyone. These difficulties were heightened because he was not Guatemalan and not a part of the native structure of the distribution of power there. This made him a danger in the eyes of the army and an outsider among the people of the village. And those dynamics made his work with the various groups complicated and intricate. Stan lived amongst this turbulence. He had parishioners who were allied with the subversion going on there, as well as those who worked for the government. There were also parishioners who used this time of suspicion and distrust to settle their scores with their neighbors and to come out on top as everyone battled for survival there. It was a difficult time to do pastoral work. Stan had to find a way to acknowledge the presence of the army and their need for order and authority. He also had to deal with the underlying realities of injustice and unfairness that propelled so many into the arms of the guerrillas and their message of subversion and change. In addition, he had to address the ratones, as they said, that's Spanish for rats, who betrayed their neighbors and sold out their own people, fellow parishioners, to the army. It was difficult. In January of 1981, Stan received a message from a friend of his that his name had been placed on a list of those to be killed. This was nothing to take lightly since other lists had been made and the people on them had been murdered. In response, he fled the parish. He and his Guatemalan associate, Father Pedro Bosel, came to Oklahoma while the tensions in the village reached record heights. Stan stayed until Holy Week of that year, 1981, when he returned to the village to take up his ministry again. In July of that year, the tensions were still high. Some other priests around Guatemala had been killed, and a number of his parishioners had been kidnapped and disappeared. At this time, Stan changed his sleeping arrangements, opting to stay downstairs in the rectory in a small room off the stairwell, rather than his normal bedroom on the second floor. It was all part of the alteration in attitude and impact that was his response to this time. And we ought to understand what this was all about so as to understand what Stan was doing. It's easy to read these lines and imagine that moving from one place to another was merely opting for one bedroom over another. In fact, this small choice was the product of Stan's understanding of his ministry and his state of life there in the village. It was also an expression of what Stan wanted for his ministry and for his ultimate witness in his priesthood. Those sound like bold claims in the context of choosing a bedroom, but there are no meaningless elements in the saintly life. And these were not meaningless. The rectory the Oklahomans had moved into had been built many years before by the same methods and style of the church. It had substantial masonry walls about 12 inches thick, faced with plaster in and out. The windows were narrow, too small to allow anyone access, and the house sat on the main square next to the church, a small fortress in the middle of the village. When the Oklahomans arrived, they put a second story on the house to accommodate the team of priests who came to live and work there, laying wooden beams across the top of the older walls and building up a wooden frame on the beams. They were able to add a dormitory area, a kitchen, as well as a sitting room, living room area, all accessible by a staircase from the first floor. It was a welcome addition, but it was not quite the fortress the first floor was. Father Rother's normal bedroom had been on the second floor, not far from the balcony, outside of the living room, looking out over the square. It was possible to get to the second floor from the outside if you were willing to shinny up the posts supporting the balcony and then going through the doors or windows facing the balcony and then into the priest's living area. The Oklahomans had not built for security, but for ease and accommodation and access. And these attributes worked well for Father Stan until the circumstances of the village changed. Suddenly, being secure from the outside had become a premium. And this was because Stan had seen his parishioners kidnapped and taken away. When this first happened, those parishioners would be tortured to death and their bodies dumped on roadways and garbage dumps as warnings to others who might take up arms or oppose the government or simply be pointed to by informants. As these kidnappings began to increase, the army switched tactics and simply buried the bodies in hidden graves, having the disappearance of the people play on the imaginations of their families who never knew what happened to them. A man or woman could be taken, tortured, and murdered, and then the same torturers would tell the family he had run off to the capital or to the coast and had abandoned them. It left a legacy of uncertainty and confusion that unnerved everyone. No one quite knew what was happening or who was responsible. Everyday life became a miasma of doubt and danger affecting everyone. And all of this was prompted by the dodgy insubstantiality of evil that no one could quite put their finger on. Because what was happening was deniable. At least those in charge denied it. Army jeeps pulled up and kidnapped people in the open air, dragging them away from their families in front of everyone, and then they were never heard or seen again. But there was always the indefinite wondering. Maybe the rumors were true. Maybe this poor soul had decamped to the border and was now living undercover. It could be just the case that Juan or Jose had just given up and run off into the mountains to escape suspicion or accusation. It was always possible. The fact that no one heard of them again only intensified the possibility. People who wanted to disappear disappeared. Maybe it was possible they weren't disappeared by savage torturers who tore their body to shreds as they extracted information from them. Maybe it was all different. That was the result of those tactics of silence. Evil thrives in the dark. Its power is leveraged by the unknown, and it grows in the shadows. In the book of Genesis, after having eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, when Adam hears God moving about in the garden, he runs to hide in the shade so that he might not be seen. This was the case in Guatemala, where the more anyone looked, the more murky it became. This was especially true of those who were pursuing the anti-insurgency campaign. They wanted everyone to question who might be responsible for the killings and the sequestration. It was the intent of all of them to keep everyone guessing, so as to keep everyone from knowing exactly and perfectly what was really taking place. And especially by denying and lying about what they were doing, they could keep the press and their leaders and their sponsors away from accepting responsibility for what was happening. All anyone could say was that violence had increased with the coming of the army, but having no absolute proof, there was no absolute truth to be grasped. And Stan saw this play out firsthand. He knew this tactic. He'd heard the rumors about the disappeared, and he saw its impact on the widows and the children of those who weren't coming back. Contemplating the possibilities of his own situation, he endeavored not to play into this conspiracy of silence and denial. He knew exactly what could happen if he were taken. He could be tortured, his body shredded as they extracted the information they wanted, and then his body would be thrown into an unmarked grave with all the others who had disappeared by the death squads. And the rumors would start, all the more juicy because he was a priest. He would disappear, and rumors of him living in Mexico with some romantic attachment he supposedly had would circulate. Or it would be said he had gone back to the U.S., but not to Oklahoma because he had left the priesthood. Or some would say he had taken money from the parish and was living safely and easily in Costa Rica or Europe or Chicago or some other hidden seclusion, all unprovable and unknowable. He would just disappear. And he was resolute that this inevitability would not take place with him. He was firm that he would face the evil of his situation, and he would do it face to face. In order for those who came for him to take him, they would have to come for him directly and take him by main force. In doing so, he would resist. That was all part of the equation for him. He was not going to go easily. In fact, he shared with me personally that, quote, "If they come for me, they'll never get me out of the house alive," unquote. This was not simply some boast about resistance. It was his conviction about the situation in which he found himself. Thus, when he felt the tensions rise in the parish, he knew his life was in danger, so he made a move to secure the room downstairs. There was only one door in and no other. The windows were narrow, and no one could force his way in there. To come for him, they had to come at him. In the dark of the morning, as they made their way into the rectory, they didn't know of his conviction. They made their way upstairs to his normal bedroom, but found only a Guatemalan there, the brother of Father Rother's associate. The squad forced him to show them where Stan was sleeping, and he led him down the stairs to the door, and he said the fatal words, "Father, they've come for you." Stan knew his guest, and he knew him. He knew that he was being held at gunpoint. There were also sisters in the convent in the back part of the compound, as well as a guest that was staying with them, all of whom were vulnerable. So, as he knew they were coming for him, he unlocked the door, and the men rushed inside. I'm certain that at that point, Father Stan went for their weapons. In his conviction about what he must do, his life was already forfeit to them. There was no way he was going to survive this moment. His only intent was to cause the amorphous, uncertain evil skulking in the dark to show itself in his struggle to the death, which is what he did. By way of his pushback against him, they shot him and left him dead on the floor of his bedroom. There was no ambiguity, nothing left of rumor or innuendo, no half-truths left behind. They had come to extinguish his voice and to take his life, and so they did, by leaving him dead in a pool of his own blood. The contest was between the certainty of knowledge and the vastness of ignorance. His death brought into light the ultimate certainty. Father Rother was killed because the powers at work in Guatemala wanted him dead. Now, this is a lesson to all of us. Not that we should endeavor to face pistols drawn and force those who come for us to choose between failure or death. The lesson is that eventually we will have to choose. We will have to come face to face with evil. It will not be avoided. Of course, We'll spend a lifetime negotiating our way in a fallen world in which we'll be challenged to find the pathway forward in the midst of confusing and difficult choices. This is how life goes. But we must do so always aware that evil lies in wait for us, and we'll have to confront it. We'll have to be resolute. It will take all of our ingenuity to bring it into the light. And as we do, it'll take our ingenuity to confront it. And we'll have difficulty understanding it. Its outline will often escape us, but the more we grapple with it, the clearer it will become. And finally, we'll have to work to resist it. Our resistance will have to be direct and purposeful. We'll eventually come to understand that we won't be taken away by it. As the death squad left, they walked out of the front door, as cool and purposeful as mechanics laying down their tools at quitting time. They'd come for the American priest. He had resisted, and they'd killed him. They had not quite gotten what they came for, but he was dead, and they were alive, and the darkness closed around them. But because Stan was a believer in the power of resurrection and the promise of new life, his death was not the end. His witness brought to light the excesses of the army and the brutality of the regime. By suffering as his people had suffered, this American shone light on the price being paid by those who were the casualties of the Cold War played out in the middle of Guatemala. Arguments about communism and security condensed into the hard truth of his corpse lying amid the blood on the floor of his bedroom, and became an irresistible fact for those making the decisions in Washington and Moscow, because the meaning of life is not limited to life. We believe in the gift of Jesus, whose life was not ended by the power of death. This power is not the last word. It supersedes evil and shines through the obscurity of uncertainty. While Stan lay dead, his witness shouted out to all those listening that the hovering brutality of their lives was real, but it would eventually be overcome in love. St. Paul wrote that his sufferings made up for the sufferings lacking on the cross of Christ. It was his way to say that our own sufferings are linked to Jesus' suffering on the cross, and thus they participate in the redemption of the world. Stan's death brought the whole world closer to the redemption Jesus won, and his example brings us all closer to the redemption offered to us, that we may face the truth of evil and know it will not overcome us. In fact, as we face it, we too will contribute to the redeeming act of Christ for the salvation of everyone. All suffering is redemptive, as all witness is meaningful. We're invited to witness and to suffer so as to bring the gift of Christ into the world, just as Blessed Stanley Rother did on this, the 43rd anniversary of his death. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called, "And So the Night." Why is the world built so that we all must rest, to pause our doing and saying in nature's interest? Would not the purpose of life be better realized if the concourse of our busyness were better sized? Just look and see the flight of the planets and path of the stars are ceaseless as the vibrations of the atomic and the molecular. Unless we, in the complications of life's concourse, must pause to renew contact with our life source. And in the darkness that passes in time so slowly, we can gaze inside toward the lilting poetry that can be heard only when creaking nature is paused and all voices drowned out in effect and cause, and then notice and in time paid attention to, and we then find how we must act and what we must do. For in the infinite wonders of time and space, dreams are the fire that powers and animates. That's "And So the Night." Let us take also this occasion to remember all of those killed in the Guatemalan Civil War that went on for almost 25 years. All of them are precious in God's sight and are witnesses of God's love.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.